The Tuesday morning light came through the northeast window at an angle that made the carpet look almost warm. Stephen Walsh noticed things like that. She had been noticing things like that for 3 years, since the first morning she had unlocked the third door on the left and set her stamp and her thermos on the desk and thought, "This will do." She was 34 and a notary public, and she worked out of a shared office suite on the 4th floor of a building on Garland Street that also housed, on its better furnished half, the firm of Holt and Associates, which described itself as a professional services consultancy, and which was, in practical terms, a small empire of managed impressions run by one woman with a talent for making other people feel the precise weight of their own insignificance. The suite ran long and narrow, with Miriam Holt's offices taking the north end and the shared common areas, and the smaller rental desks running south toward the elevator bank. Stephen's station was one of those southern desks. She leased it for $600 a month, paid on the first, and she had never been late. The desk itself was not particularly large. She had fitted it with a calendar blotter, a tiered file holder, a portable stamp pad, and the thermos of coffee she brewed at home each morning in the dark, because the shared kitchenette at the end of the hall was more often than not occupied by Miriam's assistant, a thin, perpetually apologetic young man named Todd, who seemed to spend most of his time guarding the single-serve machine as though it were a sensitive document. On that particular Tuesday, the elevator doors opened at 9:47, and the man who stepped out did not look like anyone who would change the arrangement of anything. He was wearing a dark jacket over a grey pullover, unremarkable clothes slightly rumpled at the collar. He carried no briefcase, only a manila folder tucked under one arm. He walked to the small reception ledge at the south end of the suite where Stephen sat, set the folder on the counter, and said he needed a witness signature and a notarial acknowledgement on a property acquisition document. Stephen said that was exactly what she was there for. His name, he told her when she asked for identification, was Daniel Carew. He handed her a driver's license across the counter without any of the small theatrical impatience that people sometimes performed when they were important and felt the process beneath them. He waited while she recorded the entry in her log. He answered her questions in sentences that were short and exactly sufficient. He did not check his phone. The document itself was 32 pages of acquisition language and exhibit schedules, and when she turned to the signature block and saw the transaction value typed in full, she kept her expression level and her hand steady, because $42 million was not the kind of number she usually encountered before 10 in the morning, and it was not her business to be surprised by the numbers on documents she was witnessing. She was there to confirm identity and observe the act of signing. She did both. She pressed her stamp. She initialed the witness line. She passed the folder back across the counter. And then, because her thermos was there and her coffee was still warm, and it was the thing she would have done for anyone who had just sat quietly on the other side of a transaction, she said, "I have coffee if you need a minute before you go back out." He looked at her for a moment, not the way people looked when they were passing an offer, calculating its motive, deciding whether to accept or dismiss. He looked at her the way people sometimes did when they hadn't expected kindness from the direction it came. He said he would take a cup if she had one to spare. She poured it into the thermos lid, which was also the cup, and handed it to him across the counter, and he wrapped both hands around it and stood there in the flat fluorescent light of the south hall, and Stephen went back to her morning log, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the quiet was comfortable in the way that quiet is comfortable between two people who do not need to fill it. That was the moment Miriam Holt chose to come down the corridor. She came quickly, as she always did, with the particular efficiency of someone whose movements were choreographed to signal that her time was more expensive than the air she moved through. She was 51, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, her reading glasses pushed up into precisely styled dark hair. She stopped at the edge of the South Hall and took in the scene with one sweep of her eyes, the kind of assessment that sorted and filed in less than 2 seconds. She said, to no one in particular, but to Stephen specifically, "I wasn't aware the front desk was now running a hospitality service." Stephen said, "Mr. Carew needed a notarial acknowledgement. I was just finishing." Miriam's eyes moved to Daniel with the practiced warmth of a woman who performed welcome as a separate competency. "Welcome to the suite. Were you here to see us? We don't typically see walk-ins, but if you have a matter that requires professional counsel, Todd can find you a preliminary slot." Daniel said, "I came for the notary." The warmth receded by a degree or two. Miriam's gaze returned to Stephen with the slightly glazed quality of someone looking at a piece of furniture that had been left in an inconvenient place. "I see. Well." She turned back toward the north end. She said over her shoulder, "Stephen, when you have a moment, I need the conference room accessible by 11. The locks were stiff again this morning." She did not wait for an answer. Stephen did not watch Miriam leave. She was already writing Daniel's departure time in the log. Daniel set the thermos lid back on the counter. He said quietly, "Thank you for the coffee." She said, "The conference room locks have been stiff since January. The building manages it." He picked up his folder. He looked at her once more, and there was something in it she did not spend any time examining, because she was not in the habit of examining things that had no practical shape. She noted it the way she noted the angle of the morning light on the carpet, as a thing that was present without requiring a response. He left through the elevator doors at 10:08. That afternoon, at 3:20, she heard Miriam through the shared wall. The wall between the South Hall and Miriam's primary office was not a full wall. It was a partition that stopped 8 inches below the ceiling, a compromise from the original build-out that the building owner had never corrected and that Miriam had addressed by keeping her voice modulated during client calls and letting it go during internal ones. Stephen had learned across 3 years to hear the cadence of Miriam's internal calls without processing the content. It was a useful discipline. On that afternoon, the discipline failed. She was walking back from the kitchenette with a glass of water when Miriam's voice came through the gap, already in progress, already carrying. The liability isn't just the floor space, it's the optics. Having a solo operator notary in the South Hall makes us look like a WeWork with a law library. "I've told Gerald we need to consolidate before the 3rd quarter. The lease arrangement is month to month, so it's not complicated. We just stop renewing." A pause. The other voice was inaudible through the partition. "She's been here 3 years, fine, but that's not sentiment. That's inertia." Gerald agrees. "After the Whitmore matter closes, we find something more appropriate for the space. Someone who can be client-facing without making the suite look like a shared desk farm." Stephen walked back to her desk. She set the glass down precisely in the ring it had already left on the edge of the blotter. She looked at the file holder, at the tiered stack of pending acknowledgements and certified copy requests, and the 2 apostilles she needed to finish before end of week. She looked at the thermos. 3 years was a long time to be somewhere. It was also a long time to mistake inertia for belonging. She opened the pending file and went back to work. Thursday morning, the elevator opened again at 10:16, and Daniel Carew was there with a different folder, slightly thinner, and a question about whether she could also certify a copy of a recorded instrument. She said she could. He said he would need it before noon. She said that was not a problem. She processed the certification. She stamped the copy. She was printing his receipt when he said, without preamble, "The locks on the conference room, did the building fix them?" She said, "They sent someone Wednesday morning. He tightened a plate and declared it resolved." "Was it?" "I wouldn't know. I don't use the conference room." He absorbed that. He said, The space is narrow for a full day's work. It's adequate, she said, and she meant it without apology and without performance, because it was. He accepted the receipt. He folded it in half and tucked it into the folder. He said, "The coffee was better than what I had at the meeting." She said, "That's a low bar." He smiled, and it was a small smile, the kind that required no performance on either end, and he left at 10:31. The week after that was harder. Miriam's assistant Todd brought Stephen a memo on a Wednesday morning, slipping it through the gap in the frosted glass panel of her station without knocking, which was the method Miriam used when she wanted to communicate without conferring. The memo requested that Stephen's client-facing interactions be conducted with attention to the presentation standards of the suite, and that any hospitality items, meaning food or beverages, be kept within Stephen's personal station and not offered to visitors in the common area. The memo was 2 paragraphs. It was signed by Miriam Holt, senior partner. Stephen read it twice. She put it in the file she kept in the bottom drawer of the desk, the file that held every memo and every formal communication she had received from Miriam's office across 3 years, because she was a careful person and careful people kept records without announcing that they were doing so. She did not move the thermos. Miriam's world ran on signals and compliance, and Stephen understood that every signal had a specific purpose, and the memo's purpose was to make her feel that her $600 a month did not buy her the right to be fully present in her own workspace. She had filed the understanding alongside the memo, and she had kept working. The following Tuesday was the day Daniel came back a 3rd time. This time he had no document. He had a question about the state's requirements for a specific type of affidavit related to property transfer. And it was a real question, a plausible question, but it was the kind of question that a man managing a $42 million acquisition had access to a legal team to answer, and they both knew this, and neither of them mentioned it. And so the question was answered with care and with straight facts. And he wrote down what she said in a small spiral notepad he produced from the inside pocket of his jacket. She noticed the notepad. It was the spiral-bound kind, with a dark blue cover and pages that were narrow-ruled, and the handwriting visible on the open page was small and slanted slightly left, the handwriting of someone who was left-handed, which she had not noticed before. She answered his question. He wrote. She answered a follow-up. He wrote again. The rain that had been threatening all morning had begun to come against the northeast window in small, uneven gusts, and the sound of it filled the hall in the gaps between his questions and her answers, the way rain filled a 4th-floor office that was otherwise running on the discipline of 2 people speaking softly across a counter. Todd came past the south hall with a stack of file folders held against his chest, slowed when he saw a visitor at Stephen's station, and continued without stopping, which was the most decisive thing she had ever seen him do. She watched him reach the kitchenette, set the folders down on the counter beside the single-serve machine, and stand there for a moment with the hesitant posture of a man who was no longer certain where to be. Daniel did not look up. He turned a page in the notepad and waited for her to continue. She continued. She walked him through the language the state required on the face of the affidavit, the way the jurat had to be configured, the specific phrasing the recorder's office in this county had been known to flag. She used the plain words she used with anyone who came to her with a question, because plain words were the only words she trusted for that kind of work. He asked about the recording timeline. She said the recorder ran a 5-business-day window for property instruments under normal volume and longer when the office was short-staffed, which it had been for most of the year. He wrote that down. He asked whether she had any preference about how the corrected language should read. She said her preferences were not relevant to the question. The question was what the state required. He looked up from the notepad. He said, I asked because I wanted to know. She paused with her hand on the calendar blotter. She said, I would write it in the simplest sufficient sentence, whatever the recorder will accept on the first pass, with no flourish. He wrote that down too. Then he said, How long have you been in this building? She said, 3 years in April. Busy practice? Consistent, she said. There's a difference. He wrote something else in the notepad, though she did not see what. He closed it. He looked at the rain on the northeast window, at the way the light coming through the wet glass made a moving pattern on the carpet. He said, It's a quiet floor. She said, It is in the mornings. He said, I prefer mornings. She said, Most working people do. The afternoons are for the people who are paying for someone else to be in a room. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth did the thing it had done on the second visit, which was not a smile exactly, more the territory near one. He said, Thank you. In the same way he said everything, with no extra weight placed on the words, and he left, and she sat for a moment afterward with the particular awareness that a room can feel differently than it did before someone was in it. She went home that evening and told her sister about it. Petra Walsh was 4 years older than Stephen and had a habit of listening without interrupting, which was the trait Stephen found most valuable in another human being. They sat at the small round table in Stephen's apartment over a pot of pasta Petra had cooked, while Stephen washed the lettuce, and the radiator clicked through its evening warm-up against the wall behind them, and the windows showed the courtyard with its single planter and its line of unfilled mailboxes. And Petra ate slowly, the way she always ate, the fork loaded with care, and lifted at the same unhurried pace. She let the account settle before she said anything. She said, He came back 3 times. Stephen said, Twice professionally, once with a question he already knew the answer to. Petra considered her pasta. She said, What does he look like? Stephen said, Ordinary. Petra looked at her. He's composed, Stephen amended. He doesn't waste movement. Petra said, That's not ordinary. Stephen said that she didn't know what he was, that he could be anyone, that she wasn't the person who spent time turning strangers into something they hadn't established themselves to be. Petra said she knew. They ate. The apartment was warm. On the following Thursday morning, a woman named Eleanor Voss came in just before 10. Eleanor was 73, and she had been Stephen's client twice before, once for a deed transfer when her husband was ill, and once for an advance healthcare directive that had taken 2 appointments, because Eleanor had insisted on reading every line out loud. She arrived now with a paper bag from the pharmacy on Dyer Street, and a look on her face that was the particular look of someone who has realized, late in a process, that they have made an error that has real cost. The error was in a corrective affidavit her previous attorney had drafted and asked her to have notarized, and the problem was that the affidavit had a typographical error in the property legal description, which her new attorney, who was handling the estate, had noticed, and which now required a fresh affidavit with a corrected description, which meant another $90 notarization fee on top of everything else Eleanor was already managing. Eleanor set the pharmacy bag on the counter and said she was sorry to be trouble. Stephen said she wasn't trouble. Eleanor said she had the new affidavit, and she produced it from her coat pocket, folded in thirds, slightly damp at one corner. She said she hoped Stephen could do it today and that she understood if there was a fee and she had $60, but not quite the $90, and she had hoped to cover the difference next week. Stephen took the affidavit. She smoothed it flat on the desk. She said, Let's take care of this today. We'll sort out the rest. She completed the affidavit. She stamped it, initialed the witness line, recorded it in the log. She filled out Eleanor's receipt with the fee amount, and then she folded the receipt and set it to one side and said, There's no charge for corrections. Consider it part of the original service. It was not part of the original service. It was $90 out of her own operating margin, because the original transaction had cleared and the 90 was simply gone. Eleanor protested gently, twice. Stephen said it was handled. Eleanor protested a third time, and Stephen said, "Eleanor, you came in the rain with the corrected document and you waited in this hall while I did it right. That's courtesy, and I don't charge for courtesy." Eleanor gathered her paper bag and her now notarized affidavit, and she said in the particular voice of someone who means it, "You're a good woman, Stephen." Stephen said, "Come back if you need anything else." She was not aware that Daniel was standing at the far end of the south hall. He had come in while Eleanor was explaining the situation, had stopped at the reception ledge to wait, and had not made a sound. He had watched Stephen process the affidavit, smooth the document, complete the receipt, and fold it to one side. He had heard the exchange. When Eleanor stepped into the elevator, he had remained where he was, holding his unremarkable jacket by the collar, and he looked at Stephen with the expression of someone who had been watching for a particular thing for a long time and had just found it. Stephen looked up and found him there. She said, "I didn't hear you come in." He said, "I know." A silence. He said, "I wanted to ask whether you could certify another document Thursday morning. Early, if that works." She said, "Thursday morning worked." He nodded, and he left, and she looked at the folded receipt she had not given Eleanor, which sat in the place where the fee should have been, and then she put it in the file folder in the bottom drawer alongside the memos, because that is where paper went that needed to be kept without being discussed. Thursday arrived with low clouds and the particular smell of rain that had already passed. Stephen came in at 8:40, earlier than usual, and arranged her station with the extra attention she gave it when she expected a full morning. She aligned the stamp pad with the edge of the blotter. She filled the thermos at home and brought it in the bag she used when she expected to be there past 4. At 9:52, the elevator opened. 2 men stepped out. Daniel was one of them. The other was someone she had not seen before. A man of about 40 with a close-trimmed beard and an expression of mild, unhurried authority, carrying a slim briefcase and wearing the kind of suit that was not showy, but was undeniably not rented. He was talking as they walked, and Daniel was listening, and they came to the reception counter together. The other man looked at Stephen and said, "Is the notary available?" "We have a suite transfer affidavit and a secondary certification. We were told to ask for Walsh." Stephen said, "I'm Walsh." He said he was Lyle Carew, that he worked with Daniel, and that they needed 2 acknowledgements and a certified copy. He set the briefcase on the counter and opened it. It was at this precise moment that Miriam came down the corridor. She came the same way she always did, with the same efficient clip of heels, the same posture of contained importance. She reached the edge of the south hall and registered the 2 men at Stephen's counter, and did what she always did when she registered visitors, which was to perform the instantaneous social calculation that told her where they stood, what they might be worth, and how much of her attention they merited. She looked at Lyle's suit. She recalibrated upward. She said, "Good morning. Can I help you find the right office? Holt and Associates is just at the north end if you have a professional matter." Lyle looked at her with the polite, faintly puzzled expression of a man who had already found what he was looking for. He said, "We're with the notary. We've been working with this office for the last few weeks." Miriam's eyes moved to Daniel, who was watching this exchange with no particular expression at all. She said, in a slightly warmer register, "Of course. Are you in real estate? We handle a good deal of property-related advisory work at the North End. Consulting, due diligence, that sort of thing." Lyle said, "We have internal counsel for that. We're here for the acknowledgements." He looked at Stephen. We're also here because Mr. Carew wanted to flag that the suite transfer in question involves this building's fourth floor, the full fourth floor. Miriam's smile sustained itself by visible effort. Lyle reached into the briefcase and set a document on the counter between them. It was a lease acquisition agreement, and the parties named on the cover page were legible at a normal reading distance. One of them was a private real estate investment trust called Carew Capital Group, Regional Holdings, and the name of the regional director listed in the party identification block, in standard 12-point text, was Daniel J. Carew. Miriam read the cover page. She read it again. The smile that she had sustained across 30 seconds of this conversation made a small, involuntary adjustment, the corners pulling in slightly, the warmth retreating from the eyes at a different rate than it retreated from the mouth, the way expressions move when the face has not yet been told what the mind already understands. She said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I've had the pleasure of an introduction." And she was looking at Daniel when she said it. Daniel said, "We've met. I came in a few weeks ago to get a document notarized." He paused. "You mentioned the conference room locks." Miriam said, "Of course," with the cadence of someone who did not, in fact, remember, but who would rather walk barefoot on a hot floor than admit it. "Of course, I remember now. You're with—" She gestured toward the document without touching it. "Carew Capital," Lyle said pleasantly. "We've been looking at this building for the better part of 6 months. The fourth floor is the acquisition target. The trust is the purchaser on record." He looked at the document. "Daniel has been here a few times in that capacity. He mentioned he'd been using the notary on this floor." He looked at Stephen with a straightforward expression that held no performance in it whatsoever, which, from our side, has been useful. Miriam's hand moved to the back of her reading glasses, the gesture she made when she needed a moment that looked deliberate. She said, "I see." Stephen was already reviewing the affidavit Lyle had placed on the counter, reading the signature blocks, checking the notarial section for the required elements. She did this with the same attention she brought to every document, because the numbers on it and the names on it were not her business to be surprised by. And the social weather that had just shifted in the south hall of the fourth floor of the building on Garland Street was not something she had arranged and was not something she needed to acknowledge with more than the even tempo of her own work. She said, "I'll need a current ID from both signatories, please." Lyle produced his immediately. Daniel produced his with the same quiet absence of theatre he had shown the first time, sliding the license across the counter and waiting while she recorded it in the log. She stamped the first acknowledgement. She stamped the second. She initialed the witness lines on both. She stamped the certified copy. She completed the receipts with the correct fees, and she noted the transaction in the log with the time and the document description and the name of each signer. She handed the receipts across the counter. Lyle said, "Thank you. I'll let the Trust's real estate team know you're available for future acquisitions in the region, if that's all right." Stephen said, "That's what I'm here for." Miriam had not moved from her position at the edge of the south hall. She was standing in the way that people stand when the floor beneath them has not literally shifted, but they can feel that something has, and they are deciding whether to move first or to wait and see what is expected of them. Her reading glasses were still in her hand. She had not put them back. She said to Daniel, in a voice that was considerably more careful than any voice she had used in Stephen's presence across 3 years, "I hope the space has been suitable for your needs. If there's anything at the north end that could have been made more convenient during your visits, please do let us know." Daniel said, "Everything was exactly what it needed to be." He looked at Stephen as he said it, and the look had the quality of something he had been waiting a reasonable amount of time to make unambiguous. The service here was exceptional. Lyle snapped the briefcase shut. He said it was good to meet everyone. He said they'd be in touch through the Trust's counsel regarding the acquisition timeline. He and Daniel walked back to the elevator. Miriam watched them go. The elevator doors opened. The elevator doors closed. The south hall was quiet. Stephen picked up her pen and dated the bottom of the log entry, because every transaction required a dated, signed log entry before she could call it complete. Miriam said, from the edge of the hall, "I wasn't aware you had been working with a firm of that standing." Stephen said, without looking up, "He came in as a walk-in. He needed a notarial acknowledgement." A silence. Miriam said, "He mentioned he'd been back several times." Stephen said, "A few." Another silence. The kind that happens when someone is making a calculation and the answer is not what they needed it to be. Miriam said, "The memo I sent last week about hospitality in the common area. It was perhaps more broadly worded than I intended." Stephen finished the log entry. She capped the pen and set it back in its tray, aligned with the lip of the desk, as it always was. She said, "I'll keep it on file." She meant the memo, and she thought Miriam probably understood that she meant the memo, and she did not elaborate, because elaboration in that moment would have been a kind of performance, and Stephen was not a woman who performed. Miriam said, "I'll leave you to finish up." She walked back toward the north end. Her heels on the corridor floor made the same sound they always did. She did not move any differently than usual. She was a disciplined woman in that respect, and Stephen gave her that, without warmth but without contempt. The world did not require contempt. It only required that she go on being who she was. She sat for a while after the suite went quiet. The log was closed. The stamps were in their tray. The certified copy and the 2 acknowledgements were in Lyle's briefcase, on their way out of the building, presumably toward a closing table or a counsel's office where they would do what property acquisition documents did. She had no opinion on what they would do there. She had witnessed the signatures and confirmed the identity of the signers, and completed her record, and the rest of it was not her work. She thought about Eleanor's affidavit, still in the bottom drawer with the receipt she hadn't given. She thought about $90, which was a real number, not a large one, not a small one, just a specific cost she had absorbed because the work had been incomplete the first time. And that was not Eleanor's fault, and she was not in the business of distributing the costs of incompleteness to 73-year-old women who came in the rain, with damp, carefully folded documents. She thought about 3 years of $600 months, the particular feel of a desk that had become familiar through nothing more than consistent use, the way the northeast window light moved across the carpet as the morning advanced. She did not think about what Daniel had said to Miriam and what it had meant for Miriam to hear it, because thinking about that felt like the kind of pleasure that required examination before indulgence. She was aware it had been said. She had felt it land. She was willing to let it be what it was without making it larger. Her phone rang at 12:30. It was Petra. Petra said, "Are you all right? You sound quiet." Stephen said, "I'm always quiet." Petra said, "What happened?" Stephen described it. The 2 men. The briefcase. The cover page with the name. Miriam at the edge of the hall with her reading glasses turning in her hand. The sentence Daniel had said while looking at Stephen instead of at Miriam. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He came back 3 times. Stephen said, "Yes." Petra said, "Ordinary." Stephen said, "I know." There was a knock at the half-open glass panel of her station at 1:45. It was Daniel. He had come back alone this time, without Lyle, without a briefcase, without a document in a manila folder. He had the small spiral notepad with the dark blue cover, and he had his jacket still on. And he stood at the threshold of her station and said, "I wanted to make sure the receipts were correct." The receipts had been correct. They both knew the receipts had been correct. She had been processing receipts since before she could drive, and she had never issued an incorrect one. She said, "They were correct." He said, "Good." He did not leave. She looked at him with the even, patient attention she gave to everything that required her to be present in a room. He said, "I didn't plan it to go that way. The acquisition has been in progress for months. I was coming to this building for work. The notary on the 4th floor was practical." She said, "I understand." And then it was more than practical. She said nothing. She let the sentence be in the room. He said, "I'd like to take you to dinner if that's something you're open to. Not a work arrangement. Dinner." She looked at her desk, at the stamp tray, the thermos, the calendar blotter, with its grid of working days. She looked at the bottom drawer where the file folder held 3 years of memos and one $90 receipt. She said, "Thursday evenings are good for me." He wrote that in the notepad with the slightly left-slanted hand. He said he would make a reservation. He asked if there was anything she disliked. She said, "Don't take me somewhere where the noise makes it hard to talk." He said, "I wouldn't." He left the station and walked back to the elevator, and she listened to his footsteps, which were level and unhurried, and did not change when he passed the north end of the hall, the end where Miriam's office door was still closed, and where Todd was probably guarding the single-serve machine. The footsteps went all the way to the elevator, and the elevator came and the doors opened, and then the hall was quiet again. She picked up the pen. She uncapped it. She drew a clean line through Thursday on the calendar blotter, marking it occupied, and then she put the pen back in its tray and capped it, and sat in the afternoon light of the 4th floor with the knowledge that the space around her felt, for the first time in some months, entirely her own. At 4:30 she called Petra and told her about dinner. Petra said, "Ordinary." Stephen said, "Stop it." Petra laughed, and Stephen set the phone down and looked at the thermos, still at the right-hand corner of the desk where she had placed it at 8:40 that morning, slightly dented near the base from the time she had knocked it off the counter in her first week in the suite. A small imperfection she had never considered correcting, because it had been there long enough to be a feature. 3 years of Tuesdays, of $600 months, of Miriam's carefully worded memos, and Todd's apologetic footsteps and the conference room locks that were stiff from January to March. 3 years of walking in before 9 and leaving after 5, and doing the work in front of her with the attention it deserved, for Eleanor Voss, and for the man who had come in with a $42 million acquisition document and a patient willingness to wait on the other side of a counter while she did her job correctly. She thought, "This will do." It was the same thought she had carried through the third door on the left every morning for 3 years, but it was different now in the way that familiar sentences change when the ground beneath them settles into something more than habit. It was not a resignation. It had never been a resignation. It was a woman who had known what she was worth and had kept her receipt, and had been right.